Welcome to Haggy Reads for You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, Haggy, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi, everybody. It is Colleen. The 9/11 Crusade by Nancy Hopkins. Marty, what exactly is the problem? Are legitimate conspiracy buffs trying to find out how the explosives were implanted or why both towers were demolished? Sid, the problem's the government is saying that jet airliners flew into the buildings and resulting fires caused the buildings to fail and fall to the ground, one floor at a time. Sid burst out laughing. You're shitting me, aren't you? No, sir, I am not. What the hell? Sid exclaimed. It was textbook demolition. Millions watched it happen, and thousands must have heard the explosions. Oh, there are testimonies of explosions. Firemen and others radioed in concerning explosions. One wife was on the phone and her husband trapped by the fire, and she heard explosions moments before the phone went dead and the tower fell. That information has not made it to the public. Nobody outside a dedicated researcher would know this information. It was just buried by the government. So what you're telling me is that the government is denying that the towers were demolished in a pre-planned way, correct? Well, no wonder no one's asked to talk to me. No, they just want you dead and silent. Crap, Sid said, while contemplating implications of this information. Finally, he said, why would the government lie about this? It was the prudent thing to do. Towers toppling are much more dangerous than controlled demolition. Just tell the truth. What's the problem with that? Between us, I believe, and Jimmy did too, that the second tower's demolition should not have happened. It was an awful accident. But the first tower was obviously losing the top part of the building, and it would have potentially ended up in a much more destructive situation. Why would they put forth such an obviously bad lie to cover up an accident? Even one as awful as that. So give it to me again. What did they say happened? Very few steel-constructed buildings have ever fallen because of any fire. You're well aware of the construction of the towers. The main load-bearing structure was not the outside walls. It was the inside columns. They claimed the planes flew through the outside walls and into the columns, severing them. The ensuing fire, from jet fuel and inside furniture, paper, rug, and walling, further weakened the columns. Sid interrupted him. How the hell would fire weaken the columns? Those things were like a steel cage with wallboard on the outside, and wallboard would not seem to provide much fuel for fire. They claimed the original crash and explosion blew off fire retardant covering the steel and then melted the steel. Sid interrupted. I'm not an expert on fire, but I cannot imagine a fire as you describe could actually burn hot enough to melt steel. Hell, the only way I know to melt steel is to use acetylene torches, bottled oxygen, or an electric arc from a generator. Jet fuel? No way. Regardless, that's what they claim. But I think they're still pointing to the trusses as being the weak points. The steel trusses tied the outer walls to the inner core, and they were what failed. As they melted, the floors just collapsed. The point of impact broke, and the tops of the buildings collapsed onto the floor below the fire. That weight broke through that floor and so on down the tower. Sid observed. I don't know why anyone would think the trusses were the problem. Those were steel girders connecting the perimeter wall to the center core. And Marty, what I saw was two towers falling at about the speed of free fall, just as they should have. The explosives were timed to take out the structural integrity in sections, before the upper falling debris could stack up. Right. Both fell in less than 12 seconds, or free fall based upon gravity. Pancaking floors whose weight on subsequent floors would take way longer than 12 seconds. And people are buying into this crap? Apparently most, but not all, as I exemplify. How can so many believe such bullshit? I'm wondering the same thing. It has something to do with the human psyche. If someone gives you an explanation for some horrific event, humans grasp onto it and move away from the event. They have an explanation and don't want to rethink, remember, or relive the horror. Most people react like that, but some don't. Marty observed, I think more people will rethink the information when sufficient time has gone by that distills the emotional impact of that day. At least that's my hope. Right now, anyone who disputes the official story is called anti-American. You can't believe how few people will even consider an alternative explanation. I've lost more than a few friends and have relatives refusing to talk to me. Sid was incredulous. Marty, how do they explain that the massive inner columns just disappeared? I mean, come on. If the trusses and girders had failed, allowing the floors to fall, those central column beams would have been left standing. You'd have these skeletal remains still standing. I can't believe anyone would believe this story. Are they given the same reasons for both towers collapsing? I mean, come on. First tower hit might, and I don't really believe it, but might be able to collapse this way, but the second tower hit, the first to fall, probably had little damage to the central core. Hell, most of the fuel from the aircraft seemed to fly out the side of the building, based upon the incredible fireball. The second plane only caught the corner of the outer wall. I doubt there was any real damage done to most of the core, certainly not enough to, in any way, conform to that story of pancaking floors. Marty agreed. Exactly. Now, you understand the problem. Hell no, I don't understand any of this. I keep thinking of that saying attributed to Hitler that if you're gonna tell a lie, tell a big one. This has got to be the biggest lie anyone's ever told. There was silence in the car. Nellie had fallen asleep. Sid was trying to wrap his head around the incomprehensible official story, and Marty was calculating time and going over things that they had to do at the rendezvous. Marty's thoughts and increased nervousness were interrupted by Sid. Marty, when we first met at the restaurant, which seems days ago, you said you knew the towers were a controlled demolition. Who else knows? Lots of people. It's all over the internet. It's just not getting talked about in the so-called free press. It's astounding to me that so many are just buying into it. But sooner or later the truth will win out. That truth. And if you were to go public, it would happen immediately. Is that what you think I should do? I don't think you would live to do it. You seem rather pessimistic. Why? Whoever planned and executed this monstrosity are, like I've said, bigger than the biggest. A shadow government? Marty chuckled. Well, I guess you could say that. You sound like my wife. She's prone to seeing sinister figures behind everything. To be honest, Sarah is a bit of a crackpot. Believes in things like natural healing and UFOs. Claims to have seen a ghost. Nutcase. But, God, I love her. Just couldn't live with her anymore. She's a good, loving person who's prone to flights of fancy. Like what? Well, the last blow-up we had was when she was trying to tell me that there were ancient artifacts on the moon, and that's why we weren't there and why we haven't gone back. Marty just smiled. I suppose she thinks there are ancient monuments on Mars, too. Oh, absolutely. The face on Mars. That's near some ancient city. And you don't believe any of it? I believe what I see, not necessarily what I hear. Gotcha. Difference between you and me is that I listen and then I research. Some of the darndest things I've heard have turned out to be true. Like what? Like pursuing our current subject. that the list of 19 hijackers released by the FBI 3 days after the attack includes at least 5 men who are still alive. What? And even though there's concrete evidence of their miraculous survival, the FBI has never corrected that original list. Okay, give me the details, Sid directed. One hijacker, supposedly on AA-11, that hit the first tower, is alive. In a BBC report in late September of 2001, the man said he contacted the Americans and received an apology from them. He's a pilot for Saudi Arabian Airlines. His name and photograph are still on the list. Another of the AA-11 crew listed by the FBI was a guy by the name of Al-Omari. Well, 2 Al-Omaris showed up alive. The FBI list had one Al-Omari's picture coupled with the birth date of another Al-Omari, yet the FBI list was not changed. An article on September 23rd in the UK's Telegraph identified 4 men who were on the FBI's list as being alive, and the reporter actually interviewed them all. One was one of the Al-Omaris, who works for the Saudi Airlines, and a second was another Saudi Airlines pilot. According to the Telegraph, Saudi Airlines was considering legal action against the U.S. The third accused hijacker, who was supposed to be on the Pentagon plane, and the fourth, who was supposed to be on the Pennsylvania plane, were also interviewed by the reporter. Sid offered, well, maybe they had their identities stolen. Marty laughed. At least one had their passport stolen. But the fact remains, the FBI list did not change even after dead hijackers were turning up alive. How reliable is the Telegraph? Well, it's been around for more than 100 years, and I believe it has the highest circulation of British newspapers. How did the FBI claim it got such a detailed list so quickly? You say it was on the 14th that they published the list? Supposedly from the airline manifests, followed up by some other paper trails. But those original and official airline manifests have yet to be released. And 18 of the 19 hijackers were identified by 10 a.m. the same day, according to some reports. Amazingly efficient. Like maybe the list was already prepared? The sooner you tell a lie, the easier it is to have it believed. FBI Director Mueller acknowledged there might be a problem with some of the identifications, but again, the list stayed the same. How stupid do they think we are? Stupider than the stupidest, I guess. But why, Marty? Sid pleaded for an answer. What's the motive? Marty's body suddenly seemed energized. He had excitement in his voice, and he said, Sid, the best motive I've heard yet, the one that just makes me smile, is the one about missing treasure. What treasure? Now get this, bizarre as it might seem. Building 4 was a 9-story building next to the South Tower. It had vaults in the basement full of gold and silver bars. A month after the attack, Mayor Giuliani made a big deal of $230 million worth of gold and silver being recovered, still in the bomb-proof vault, and that it was being moved. But reliable sources indicate that almost $1 billion worth of gold and silver had been in the vault before 9/11. And there's a report that rescue workers found a truck in the tunnel between buildings 4 and 5 that had stacks of gold and silver bricks on it, along with some rubble. With amazement, Sid replied, Really? This sounds like that Bruce Willis Die Hard movie. Ah. It was Die Hard with a Vengeance, but they were robbing the Federal Reserve Bank. I made the connection, too, and checked it. Isn't the Fed Bank in the same area? Yep, just down the street. Did they lose money? Sid said, laughing. Nothing to know of, Marty replied. Makes for a great movie plot, but pretty unbelievable. Still a possible motive. Personally, I like the Silverstein motive. especially since you brought out the details or the idea that they had to remove the asbestos, Marty noted. Sid suddenly realized that asbestos in all that dust could have affected thousands, including Nellie. He turned around, quickly confirming that Nellie was still asleep. Lowering his voice, he asked, "Marty, is Nell in danger from the asbestos?" Marty hesitated, thinking about what to say and how to say it. "Sid, everyone around that dust could be in danger. But the real victims would be those who continued to work in the dust for months. Nell's exposure is something that only time will tell, and I don't know of anything that can be done about it. She should probably have herself medically checked out at some point." This saddened Sid and Marty. They were silent in thinking about all the victims who had yet to be identified. In hope, Sid said, "But didn't FEMA say the air quality didn't pose a risk?" "Yes, absolutely safe." "But you don't believe it." "Do you?" Neither confirmed their disbelief. They silently traveled down the interstate for a few miles before Sid asked, "Marty, you said you were on a crusade. Why you?" "My sister Jill died in the Pentagon." "Oh, wow. So sorry, Marty." "Me too. She was just a sweetheart." "Married?" "Not by law. Jill was gay, and she and her partner Anita had been together for a long time. If things had been different, they'd gotten married. But if things had been different, maybe Jill would not have been an Army civilian." "How so?" "The military has the don't ask, don't tell policy." "What the hell is that?" Sid questioned. "Guess you don't know any gay people." Sid thought a moment before agreeing. "Well, not any I'd call a friend." "Another example of how we overlook some very bad policy, 'cause it doesn't have any direct bearing on our lives. It's a policy Clinton got passed that says it's okay to be gay and be in the military as long as nobody knows. The military won't ask about sexual preference, and gays aren't supposed to let anyone know they're gay." "Well, that sounds, screwed up." "Right. Makes gays and lesbians have to dedicate their lives protecting the country while denying and hiding their basic makeup. Makes for a lot of deceit and fear of being found out." "We came from a military family. My dad and his dad were both professional soldiers. All Jill wanted to do was follow their footsteps. But with that don't tell, don't ask policy, she couldn't enlist, especially being with Anita. And that's why I think she got a job as a civilian working for the Army." Sid did not know what to say. Marty continued, "At first I thought there'd been a conspiracy involving the military, because it took so long for any fighter response. The plane that hit the Pentagon was out flying around until a transponder signal for 50 minutes before it killed Jill. I spent months researching every minute and following every conspiracy thrown out there. Then a friend introduced me to someone who was working at the Northeast Command on that day. She convinced me it really was just human confusion." "Why did you believe her?" "Some emotion you just can't bullshit. She was still so upset that the military had completely failed to protect the American people. I don't think she ever got over it. A month ago I would have had a different story, but talking with her convinced me to just let it go. Well, to let go of the idea that the military and the FAA were co-conspirators." Marty added, "There are some who believe a missile hit the Pentagon, and not AA-77. That's because Rumsfeld originally said the Pentagon had been hit by a missile, but I think he just misspoke. The real problem is authorities confiscated any and all film from cameras in the area, and the only film released was 5 frames from the camera at the Pentagon entrance security booth. Those frames don't clearly show any kind of plane coming into view before the building exploded. But a couple of my buddies and myself made a computer simulation based upon exact measurements of where that security camera was and what AA-77's actual flight path was." Sid interrupted, "How did you determine the flight path?" Broken lamp posts. We went down there and started examining everything. We soon discovered the first lamppost base, which was the one nearest the Pentagon, and the last one hit. We then just followed the line of broken lamppost bases. By the time we were able to get close, all the debris had been picked up. To verify, we looked at every photo we could locate taken on that day, and we verified that each of the 5 posts we thought had been hit turned up in a photo lying on the ground. Based upon damage to the post, we could figure at what height it was hit. That gave us a real tight final flight path. We made a computer simulation of the plane coming in and hitting each of the 5 posts at the height of damage to the post. The final trajectory was lined up with the actual damage to the building, and it all matched. Then we just had the computer rotate the image to get a side view of the plane from the same angle the Pentagon security cameras saw the event, in those 5 frames of video that were released. When we married it up with the view as seen from the security camera, it showed the plane was hidden by a concrete slab holding the gate arm just in front of the security camera. The only thing the camera would have seen, because it was a rather crappy camera, was the plane's tail, and smoke, we believe, would have been coming from the right engine that hit the 3rd light post. The video and the computer animation lined up exactly. Case closed. No missile. You know, Marty, I saw initial coverage of the Pentagon and thought the damage was not what I expected. It was like the observable hole was way too small for an airliner to have made, Sid observed. Yeah, that was one of the contributing issues that fed the missile supporters. But another airliner of similar size hit an apartment building in Europe and ended up leaving a similar small entrance. There were 100 eyewitnesses stuck in traffic on the highway directly in front of the Pentagon that saw the plane fly overhead, so close that some of them ducked. I think the problem is people thinking the wings would just stay attached, and the hole should match the entire wingspan of a Boeing 757. But some eyewitnesses claimed that as the plane struck the building that the wings detached. Thus the hole would have been narrower. And that's probably what happened. There was an electric generator just outside the building that was struck by the right engine, while the left engine almost simultaneously struck a short concrete wall. This happened at about the same time the nose of the plane was breaching the building. I think the wings just detached. That sounds probable, Sid noted. What's not probable is that a hijacker who could not even fly a Cessna with any precision was at its controls. Sid glanced at Marty but said nothing. Marty continued. Dulles Airport's tower picked up a radar blip with no transponder signal on a trajectory to the White House. It was an estimated 13 miles away, moving at a speed of 500 miles an hour, and the controller couldn't do anything except call out decreasing miles to impact with the White House. At 3 miles out, the plane suddenly turned away, and Dulles Tower thought they had been tracking a military plane. The maneuvering and speed wouldn't be anything that a Boeing 757 would be called upon to execute, and it's questionable if any pilot could actually fly a 757 that way. Dulles controllers watched it make a complete circle at 500 miles an hour and descend to 7,000 feet in 2.5 minutes before they lost radar contact. Sid was perplexed. So who was flying it? It's more of a question of what was flying it. I think all the aircraft were under remote control. Remote control? Like radio control? Sid said, while thinking of the small planes Jimmy and he had played with, where they would fly them remotely with a control box, using radio waves. Exactly, but obviously on a much grander scale. I mean, come on, the hijacker who supposedly was at the controls was Hanjour. Now, Hanjour had gotten a pilot license in 1999, but it expired 6 months later because he'd not taken the required medical exam. He'd actually been rejected in 1996 for a pilot's license because after months of attending flight school, Hanger's instructors flunked him out. The instructors believed Hanger was just not capable of flying a plane. And in the month before 9/11, Hanger had gone to Bowie's Maryland Freeway Airport 3 times to be certified to rent a Cessna from him. He flunked there too. Now, how could this person go on a month later and execute such amazing airplane flying that Dulles radar controllers thought they were looking at a military plane? I know this information, and certainly the FBI does too. So why do they keep insisting that Hanger was the pilot? Let's look further, Marty continued. Maybe it was not Hanger at the controls. Maybe it was Al-Hazmi or Almadar, who also attended flight schools and who were identified as being with Hanger on the plane. In both cases, they took a couple of lessons, but were also dropped by the instructors. One instructor said that they were so bad that he was not sure they even could drive cars. Take it further. Mohammed Atta had been named the hijacker who piloted AA-11 and hit the first tower. He and the supposed pilot of United 175, which crashed into the second tower, both attended Jones Aviation Flying Services in Sarasota, Florida. Neither passed stage 1 of the course before quitting. How did these two manage to become competent pilots in a month? Sid asked. So you're saying that none of the supposed hijacker pilots had demonstrated piloting skills immediately prior to the attacks? And this assessment of their skills came from instructors? That's right, Marty confirmed. Sid was obviously confused. Well, what the hell were they doing at the schools? Did anyone suppose that they could be taught to fly a 757 in a month? All that exercise did was provide proof that they couldn't pilot anything. What's the point to that? Marty was thoroughly enjoying Sid. Exactly, he said, before continuing. All it seems to have done is to give conspiracy buffs more fuel. Sid replied, well, if the planes were taken over remotely, did this happen after the hijackers took over the cockpits and the controls? I mean, who in the FBI could know for sure which hijacker was the pilot? Did the radio communications between the control towers and the aircraft provide that information? Did they hear their names? Or was there some voice recognition? Or what? Did the black box of cabin voice recordings give that information? The black boxes of the tower planes were not recovered. The black box of the Pentagon plane has been recovered but not released. And, Marty paused for effect before continuing, none of the ground-to-aircraft communications on any of those planes has been released. Sid looked at Marty. Why would those communications be kept from the public? Well, some of it has been released as transcripts, indicating tower-to-aircraft radio communications were normal until they stopped. There was an instance where Mohammed Atta on the first plane seemed to be talking to passengers, and the towers overheard. Sid interrupted. But Marty, it's been a year, and you're telling me the news hasn't broadcast a tape of whatever happened? Even if it was not much? Why? Don't know. Sid observed. This reminds me of Watergate and the Nixon tapes, with the missing 8 minutes on the tape. Whatever could have been on those 8 minutes was probably not as damaging as just the fact that 8 minutes were missing. If there's nothing on the flight tapes, why not just let the public hear it? Again, seems like just adding to the fire for those who think it's all a massive conspiracy. Seems rather confusing. Sid continued, I wouldn't be so interested if I could figure another way, other than transmissions between the cockpit and the ground that allowed the FBI to so quickly provide the identity of those who were supposedly piloting the planes. And I agree, Marty said while glancing at his watch. yet again. Again, Marty silently reviewed what they had to do in Allentown. Meanwhile, Sid was trying hard to find some reason not to believe in remote control over the planes. Since Jimmy's death, Sid found himself pushing any thoughts of his brother from his mind. Gradually, over the year, Sid had allowed thoughts of Jimmy to play out whenever something brought forth a memory. Time does heal grief somewhat, and thoughts of Jimmy were not as potent and unbearably painful. Now, Sid was struggling to remember every detail of the last conversation he had had with his twin. Part of the conversation dealt with remote flying of a FedEx plane. "Marty, do you know anything about a FedEx plane that was flown remotely just before the 9/11 attacks?" Marty was stunned. "Yes, but why would you know about that?" Sid hesitated, responding. He had this growing twitter in his gut that he knew was fear. Sid was afraid he would be venturing down a road that would somehow betray his brother. But Sid answered, "My brother Jimmy told me about it. It was during the last telephone call I had with him." Marty did not miss the implication. "When was that?" "A few days before the attack." "What did Jimmy say?" Sid thought some before answering. Jimmy was upbeat, but in thinking back, there was a sense of melancholy. He brought up our childhood and our parents. It was all laughing and joking and recalling funny episodes. He'd been doing that since I finished the World Trade Project and returned home. For a long time we've been estranged, but after 3 years of working together, all the bad stuff just faded away. We'd gotten really close again. It wasn't like we spent a lot of time together. I actually didn't see him on most days. But when work brought us together, it was always good, although we seldom socialized. And then after the project, Jimmy called often. During the last call, he got into stories about us flying the remote planes. Marty interrupted. "As kids?" "Well, we tried to fly some bullshit planes as kids. They never worked right. No, we really got into it recently. In fact, the only socializing we did in New York was to go out and fly those 21st century remote planes." Sid smiled, remembering how much fun they had had. "We were taking those RC planes and flying them all over the place." Marty observed. "So, in connection with those stories about remote-controlled planes, Jimmy told you about the FedEx plane?" "Right. But it was kind of old news to me. I'd seen a television show where they flew an airliner into the ground remotely. They were trying to assess fire during crash landings. Apparently, many passengers survived the initial crash, only to die by fire. Anyway, I'd seen this TV show probably a decade ago and was not impressed that they could actually land a plane remotely. When they crashed that plane, it wouldn't have taken much to have just landed it. The plane crashed halfway down and smacked in the middle of the runway." Sid paused before adding, "Guess I should have asked Jimmy for more details." Marty explained. It was a Boeing 727 with Raytheon technology on board. They were working out of Holloman Air Force Base in Mexico. They actually landed it remotely 6 times. But what I find bothersome is the timing. I know about the FedEx flight because I was studying the subject in relationship to 9/11. The earliest report I found came after 9/11. While the FedEx flight was carried out on August 25, as far as I know, the first time the FedEx exercise was announced was October 1st, 2001, by Raytheon. How the hell did your brother know about it so soon after it happened?" Sid glanced at Marty, who was looking at him intently. "I don't know," Sid said. Brad Taylor was officer in charge of the Ultra-Secret Operations Center. This was a place no one other than a secret, select group of men knew about. Technologically, this was better than the best. Brad often thought of himself as living in the future. Most of what he used daily would not become known for 50 years. Well, that was the way it used to be. As technology in the age of personal computers and that damn internet progressed, the separation between what Brad had access to and what the rest of the world used was growing shorter every day. Brad was not a happy camper in the information age. He much preferred keeping people in the dark while he stood in the light of the future. Brad had been at this ultra-secret game for over 35 years. He grew up with mind-bending advancements in espionage techniques, evolving around accelerating growth of computers, communication and space technology. His glass-walled office looked out onto the room full of equipment and a half a dozen men. The large, thin LCD computer monitor on his desk would not be sold in the store for another 5 years. It allowed him access to any of the various networks being monitored and controlled from the other side of the glass wall. The screen showed a map of the U.S. Northeast with a few dozen blinking lights. Those lights represented cars matching anything looking like a white 2000 Jeep Grand Cherokee, as seen from satellites silently watching everything moving out of New York City and traveling away from the city. They were looking for Sid Morris's vehicle. The search had been ongoing since the sun got high enough in the sky to provide details on the ground below. The map had a circle superimposed on it, indicating estimated distance. They knew the earliest time Sid would have left his daughter's apartment and calculated how far he could have traveled at top speed. The circle represented that estimated distance. Anything matching search parameters for Sid's vehicle, falling within the circle, could be their target. Brad was studying the lights on the map while talking to James Morris on the phone. Morris could see what Brad was looking at. Everything Brad could do in his office, Morris could do from wherever he was. While they had worked together many times before, Brad had never met Morris, nor knew anything about him except that James Morris was one of the biggest of the bigs. Brad had no idea who owned the Cherokee or who was in it. His only job was to find it. Brad heard Morris say, "My brother never does anything fast. Shrink the circle by 90 minutes. A few minutes later, the circle had been compressed, eliminating only a few of the lights. Many minutes passed in silence. Jimmy was trying to anticipate which way the rabbit ran. A year ago, Jimmy would have bet on North Carolina. But Sid had been traveling, and Jimmy had no clue as to where Sid would think was a safe haven. The only information Jimmy had had was the infrequent calls to Nellie. Sid had traveled out west and then south across the border, down into South America. Jimmy decided Sid would not go north. Into the telephone, Morris told Brad Taylor to focus on anything going south or west. The phone disconnected while Taylor responded, "Yes, sir, asshole," Brad thought, in response to the rude hang-up. Brad looked at the map and lights. This is going to be a long day, he realized. They would have to adjust satellite coverage to take close-up views of each of the cars represented by the lights. Some would be discarded quickly because they were not the right type vehicle. Those that were white Cherokees would require a further look until the occupants could be identified. They were looking for a man and a woman. Brad Taylor did not know that there was a third man in the vehicle he was hunting. Jimmy had hung up from Taylor and looked away from the computer screen to gaze out the window. It was a beautiful day. Great day to fly, he thought. He also realized that it had been a long time since last flown an RC plane. That's remote control. The last time was with Sid before 9/11. Jimmy also realized the most recent heart connection he had made with Sid was over those planes. He thought, I need to connect with Sid, and maybe that's the way to do it. Jimmy got up and took the walk to the hangar. Oh, not the hangar with the helicopter. Jimmy was going radio flying. As with many identical twins, Jimmy and Sid had a connection that appeared telepathic. When they were kids, the connection was often intense. The thoughts and emotions Jimmy knew were coming from Sid had grown less frequent as they grew older, and had virtually disappeared during the years of their estrangement. Jimmy hoped immersing himself in an activity that they had shared might kindle the connection again, or at least be sufficient enough to find out where Sid was heading. As he walked to the hangar, Jimmy's mind quickly moved away from thoughts of Sid to memories of radio flying. He had first gotten involved in the sport in 1974, while working at the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. They were working on a top-secret project to develop flying bombs that could be controlled the same way a model airplane can be flown remotely, by using of radio signals. Jimmy suddenly started laughing. He was remembering how stupid the FBI was. The project required them to know everything they could about radio control flying and to test out new devices. To cover this activity, they would actually fly miniature planes at Aberdeen during lunch hour. As anticipated, Cold War mentally took over, and the Soviets took notice of this activity. Every lunch hour for months, Soviet diplomats would get in boats and go out into the water surrounding the facility to spy on Americans who were radio-flying miniature planes. The FBI would follow the Soviet diplomats until it was discovered their enemies were observing innocent activities at Aberdeen. The FBI believed the story that some of Aberdeen's people were engaging in the hobby of radio-controlled flying during their lunch hour. Jimmy imagined FBI agents relating the story and detailing how stupid the Soviets were. Only Jimmy and a few others knew that it was not the Soviets who were stupid. Jimmy then recalled the first known instance of an unmanned aerial vehicle, and he continued to laugh. It happened back in 1849 by the Austrians who attacked the city of Venice using explosives attached to balloons. They used 5 23-foot diameter balloons. Big suckers, Jimmy thought, as he imagined what they must have looked like, dragging the long copper wire attached to a battery on the ground. The Austrians waited until the wind was right and let the balloons float over the water, protecting the ground approach to the city. When the balloons got over Venice, a signal flowed along the copper wire, and the bombs were dropped. Problem was that the wind shifted and blew the balloons back toward Austrians. Jimmy imagined terrified Austrian soldiers trying to get away from the oncoming balloons. Jimmy's mind flashed images of other early attempts to make flying bombs. The Wright brothers made the first airplane flight in 1903. By 1909, the first of the Sperry flying bombs was being developed. The flying bomb got close because of Sperry's invention of the gyro stabilizer, which would keep a plane flying straight and level without a pilot. Thinking of a photograph that he had seen, Jimmy chuckled. By 1917, the U.S. Navy ordered Sperry's technology to be placed in the double-winged Curtiss airframe. The idea was that the Curtiss would fly to the target, and the engine would shut off after a specific number of revolutions of the propeller. At that point, the plane, full of explosives, would simply fall to the ground. The photograph Jimmy was recalling was one where the Curtiss was attached to the top of a car. They had crashed 5 or 6 prototypes that the Navy had ordered after catapulting them into the air. Afraid of losing the last plane, they made final adjustment tests on top of the moving car. But they did get it to fly, Jimmy noted. It was the first heavier-than-air craft to fly without a pilot, even if it was only for 1,000 yards. The U.S. Army also had an early go at it in 1918. Jimmy loved the Kettering bug. The bug was also a biplane, but it was really cheaply made. It was wood, plasterboard, doped paper, and muslin. The bug was only 12 feet long with a wingspan of 15 feet and a total weight of 530 pounds. But the dang thing could fly at 115 miles an hour and carry 80 kilograms of explosives to 12,000 feet, all without a pilot. Actually, there was no place for a pilot, and there was no undercarriage. It was launched using a four-wheeled dolly on a track. All in all, the Kettering bug was a failure, but Jimmy thought the Army caught the unmanned bomb bug, and he chuckled at his own humor. Jimmy thought it ironic that the biggest impetus to unmanned aerial vehicles came from a Hollywood actor named Reginald Denny. He was a Brit and flew with the British Royal Flying Corps during World War I. After immigrating to the United States and becoming a famous actor, Denny took this hobby of radio-controlled model planes into the business world. While building RC model planes at his radio plane company, Denny realized that he could build an RC aircraft to be a target drone to train American anti-aircraft gunners. By 1935, he demonstrated his invention to the U.S. Army. In the 1940s, Denny's company built almost 15,000 drones to train World War II gunners. Va-va-voom, Jimmy said aloud, thinking of Marilyn Monroe. As Norma Jean, she was working at Radio Plane when a publicity photographer snapped her picture, with her in overalls and a bandana around her head, and the rest is history. Fueled by the Cold War, improved radio control technology allowed for development of advanced target drones, and then unmanned reconnaissance aircraft. By the end of the Vietnam War, the Air Force 100th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing had proven the value of an unmanned reconnaissance aircraft. 3,435 Ryan recon drones had been successfully flown over the war zone of Vietnam. Jimmy opened the door to the small hangar. Aloud he said, "And now we have the Predator." The silver, sleek, awesome Predator sat in the middle of the room. It was one of the earlier versions used for reconnaissance, although Jimmy thought he might get a state-of-the-art Predator complete with its Hellfire missiles. Jimmy was still standing in the door looking at the Predator when he yelled, "God, I love that thing." The hangar was dominated by the 27-foot-long Predator. Model aircraft capable of being flown remotely filled the surrounding areas. Jimmy knew there were 132 models. They ranged from beginner models of trainer aircraft to aerobatic versions, which were overpowered, allowing an experienced pilot to virtually throw the planes around in the sky. Jimmy went over to the Predator and absent-mindedly touched it as he looked around. The vintage airplanes were classic designs all the way back to the 1930s, and Jimmy's favorites to just admire. A few of them he had built himself. The warplane collection covered all sorts of military aircraft, and most were scaled-down replicas of actual warplanes. A couple of the warplanes were just completely made up by the designers. The warplanes were the ones that Jimmy and Sid crashed most often. Jimmy walked back toward the hangar where the gliders were parked. These were not flown often because the basic power came from wind, and you had to be in a good place with good thermals to have any fun. The brothers had taken over the Berkshire Mountains one weekend and had more fun than any other outing. Remembering that weekend saddened Jimmy. He looked away and stared at the blimp, which was just the opposite of the gliders. A blimp had to be flown inside or completely still outside air. Sid never saw the collection of blimps. And as Jimmy started walking around, he visited the collection of off-craft, such as the bird-like ornithopters, powered by flapping wings. Not much fun to fly, but really looked cool to look at. Two other cool-look vehicles were the Flying Witch and Flying Lawnmower, both only taken on solo flights. And there were a dozen versions of radio-controlled helicopters. Jimmy stopped and looked for a moment before going on to his final destination at the north side of the hangar. There were the parked jets. Some of the jets were as large as full-size desks and complete with miniature gas turbine engines. These jets were impressive on the ground or in the air and had great sound effects. They were also way expensive, and Sid never saw these either. Jimmy would have had to explain spending too much money for just a hobby, and Sid never got a clue that Jimmy had an unlimited access to money. The 2 jets that the brothers had flown often were custom-made for Jimmy. They did not have turbines. Instead, they were powered with electric duct fans. One was blue with Sid's name on the nose. The other was dark red and named Jimmy. They had used relatively cheap jet models to get the feel of flying with speed. But after crashing those a few times, Jimmy figured they could fly better. Sid had really chided his brother over owning the 2 replica jets, knowing that they had to be expensive. In addition to the jet itself, the requirements to fly included the radio transmitter. The radio signal from the transmitter would be picked up by the onboard receiver, controlling servos that moved various parts to fly the aircraft. Depending upon the setup, an aircraft could be rolled, moved up and down, left to right, speed adjusted, landing gear activated, flaps moved for lifting or drag, and activation of a multiple of other gadgets such as lights, cameras, or bomb doors. These additions were on some of Jimmy's advanced models. The ones he flew with Sid were comparatively simple, but they sure could fly. Jimmy bent over and picked up his red jet. During their last outing, the brothers had been dogfighting, and it ended with a head-on collision. Neither plane would fly again without some real fixing. Had it been another plane, Jimmy would have just chucked it, but he could not bring himself to throw out either beat-up plane. Like a little boy, Jimmy started hand-flying while making the sounds of a jet. Up above his head he moved the jet, then down to his side in a banking maneuver. Jimmy was in the process of dive-bombing his brother's parked blue beat-up jet when he saw the image pop into his mind. It was a green highway traffic sign with the word Allentown. Sid had not really taken notice of the sign indicating Allentown, Pennsylvania, was the next exit. It was Marty's explanation of, "Oh shit, we need to take this exit," that started Sid and forced him to focus on the sign. "Damn, Marty, you just put my heart into my throat." Marty was obviously agitated and almost screaming, "We have to take this exit." "Okay, don't worry," Sid said while preparing to get over and exit. For the last half hour, Sid had been relating some of his travel exploits taken during the last year. Nellie had awakened, and it was her questions that initially got Sid talking about his trip. Sid was an excellent storyteller, and Marty had gotten preoccupied with listening to Sid rather than concentrating on what had to be done in Allentown, and Marty had lost track of time. Sid was stealing glances at Marty, realizing that his passenger was truly intense. "What's up, Marty?" "Okay, here it is. Nell, you need to take everything in the car and move it into the driver's side next to you. Sid, your gas tank's on the driver's side, yes? We're going to swap cars." Sid was perplexed and confused. He loved his car and had no desire to swap it. "Now wait a minute, Marty. I'm not about to swap out my car." "Sid, I'm sorry. I meant to discuss this before now. We have to assume that satellites can be tracking us." Before he could continue, Nellie entered the argument with, "Marty, how the hell could a satellite be tracking us?" Marty, still agitated, started to reply with anger, but instead he took a deep breath and continued with control. "They'd know what car Sid drives. They'd tell the satellite network to look for anything resembling a Jeep Cherokee in a targeted area corresponding to the distance that we've gone in the allotted time. The next thing that they do is to start to focus in on each potential target to eliminate it as not being a Cherokee. If it is a Cherokee, they'll try to get a close-up of the occupants. Please, just do what I ask and get things together." Nellie touched her father's shoulder, asking with one word whether she should fall into this paranoia of Marty's. "Dad?" Sid was now agitated. The real world of crap had taken over the car. A moment later he replied, "I hate to say this, but do as Marty asks." To Marty he said, "Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they're not out to get us." Sorry, Sid. I'd rather be safe than stupid. We have to assume the worst. They were nearing the end of the exit, and Marty directed, go north on Lehigh Street. Marty glanced at Nellie, who was working very fast to move everything from the far back of the Jeep toward the front and next to her. Marty then focused on looking for the IHOP restaurant on the east side of the street. He saw it approaching and confirmed the gas station was on the left, across from the restaurant. Sid, pull into that IHOP and park as close to the entrance as you can. Nellie asked, Dad, I have everything we put into the car last night. What else do you want from the back? Sid moaned, Well, everything. But, Dad, there are 2-foot lockers of stuff. I know what's back there, sorta. I've been living in this Jeep for a year. Sid started silently recalling what he had. Marty was cursing himself. How the hell did he end up waiting too long? Well, he'd not thought things through enough to realize that Sid would have his whole life in the car. Look, Sid, you only need the very essentials. Well, those I have in the bag. Sid looked around and saw his brown tote next to Nellie. But there are survival articles back there. Like what? Marty asked. Cold weather gear for one thing, in the trunk on the driver's side. Marty said to Nellie, Open up the trunks and put anything you see that we might need into bags you already have. It did not take long for Nellie to start pulling things out of the first trunk. She took a few pieces of warm clothing and then asked, What about the toilet paper? Sid knew how important that could be and said, Well, at least a roll of it, and the towel and the washcloth. Nellie saw the plastic bag with the towel and the washcloth and said, Yuck, no way am I taking that. When was it last washed? Sid realized that he had to release the concept of living out of the car. Okay, go to the other trunk. There's a first aid kit, and in the small green bag is basic survival gear. Marty interrupted with, Sid, I hope we'll not have to go that deep underground. Marty, I'd rather be safe than stupid, as you said. You now have me completely paranoid. Sid was turning into the parking lot of the IHOP and navigating to the closest open parking space to the entrance. Nellie found the green bag and the first aid kit under the small grill. There were also other cooking utensils like a pot and a pan and knife, fork, mug, and plate, all made out of aluminum. Dad, you really shouldn't be cooking with aluminum. The comment made both Sid and Marty laugh. The laughter took away some of the stress, but now Sid had the car parked and turned off the engine. Nellie stopped moving and asked, What about the hunting knife? Marty and Sid exchanged a look before Marty said, Yes. Marty decided, You guys have another shirt or jacket you can give up? I need you to wear an outer shirt into the restaurant that you can leave in the car. Nellie started looking in her bag and found a shirt she did not really like. She was putting it on when Sid said, Take that green shirt from yesterday from my bag. It was a struggle, but Sid was able to pull it on again without exiting the car. A moment later, Sid asked, We good to go? I really need to use the restroom. Nellie was looking through the trunks once more. I think so. Marty looked at his watch again. It was 9:10, and the swap-out was scheduled for 10 sharp. As long as he did not get a phone call canceling, everything should be on schedule. Hey, Sid, mind if I use your cap? Sure, go ahead, Sid replied. If we're being watched, it might delay them in identifying me, Marty noted as he put on the New York Yankees baseball cap. And we need the cap identified. Sorry, Sid. Hope you don't have a love of the cap, too, because we're going to leave it in the car. The threesome got out of the Jeep and walked quickly into the restaurant. All three were wondering if some spy satellite was looking down at them. Jimmy put down his jet. He carefully placed it nose to nose with Sid's blue jet, simulating the position of the last crash and final flight of two much-loved toys. After a moment of remembering, Jimmy quickly walked out of the hangar door, closing it behind him. As he started toward the house, Jimmy began walking with a purpose. He had a mission to accomplish. Of all the multitude of aspects to the 9/11 event, Jimmy found it preposterous that anyone actually thought untrained hijackers could have so skillfully plowed airliners into the towers and the Pentagon. Where were all the RC aircraft hobbyists? He silently wondered. It wouldn't take a rocket scientist to know how simple it would simply be to fly the planes remotely. Not one mainstream media outlet openly considered the possibility that the planes were controlled remotely. It seemed such an obvious link to make. Everyone is familiar with the fact that aircraft can be landed when visibility would make it impossible without help of instruments. Everyone knows planes have autopilot capability. When the whole scenario had been presented to him, Jimmy laughed. Dan Carlin had gotten so pissed off he threatened to have Jimmy fired. Carlin was one of the few people that Jimmy feared. No one was fired. Firing was another word for killing. Carlin was so ruthless, Jimmy considered him a sociopath. Carlin was not alone in thinking the American people would believe anything that the government told them was true. Carlin commented, "James, you know that they've been conditioned. They are sheep, incapable of thinking outside the box that we've built for them." Jimmy grudgingly realized they actually were going to try this scenario, and he countered, "Well, that's the American people. What about the rest of the world?" "We're working on it," Carlin replied, "but it doesn't matter anyway, does it?" Morris knew this arrogance was probably justified. The elitists had been doing whatever they wanted for so long they knew the average citizen could not stop them, no matter what country that they were citizens of. In the end, James Morris was just as powerless to stop 9/11 as anyone could be to tell the truth about 9/11. It was not a fight that he could win, and so Morris jumped aboard with enthusiasm. If it worked, it would open all sorts of doors. It was so brazen that Morris wanted to be right in the midst of it all, and he was well aware of the fact that he was the only person in the world who could actually pull it all together. It was only Morris who could prepare the towers for demolition and ensure the planes would be guided to their targets without the assistance of a pilot. All for glory. Marty made sure that they were seated in a position to observe the gas station across Lehigh Street. There could be nothing to see. As he explained to Sid and Nellie, "We're simply going to leave here and go across the street to get gas. The canopy over the pumps would block the satellite monitoring. The new car will pull in next to us on the other side of the pumps. That driver will take your car, Sid, and we will take the new car. New car will be a rental." Marty had already ordered for the three while his companions had been in the restroom. As the waitress brought coffee, Marty went to relieve himself. When the waitress left, Sid asked Nellie, "How well do you really know this guy?" Nellie continued pouring coffee and did not immediately answer. "Dad, there was a dead man in my kitchen who was trying to kill us. Right now, that's all I'm focusing on. Without Marty, you and I'd both be dead. Bottom line is, we have no one else to trust." "But Nell, I love that Jeep," Sid exclaimed. "Get over it," Nellie said while flashing an exaggerated smile, which made Sid chuckle. "This is so Twilight Zone-like," Sid noted. Marty was returning and heard Sid's last remark. As he scooted along the bench, Marty observed, "Reality is not what you think it is. I know you must be doubting me, and that's only because you haven't completely come to grips with this new reality. There are bad people wanting to do bad things, and they all have the tools in the world to accomplish their tasks. You just got caught up in the real reality by accident. I've been here most of my life, and that was a choice, or maybe a necessity." "How so?" Sid asked. "My dad was in the Army, and we relocated regularly. As you may have guessed, I was a bit nerdy and never had any friends until I got computers. After that, at any school I went to, including college, I would search out anyone into computers. There's an immediate connection between computer nerds, and it was like having friends all over the world. Then we all got into video games. We did not wait for someone else to build the next game. We were good enough to build them ourselves." We were into game making and also into perplexities of the games that men were playing with the planet and with humanity. Our games were structured on what we considered real-life protagonists. This scenario is A27. How did you get away from satellite coverage of an escape? We'd take specific situations and game them until we considered every angle. Then these would go into our war manual. The manual was really for gaming, but it was also designed for real life. Anyone, like me, who found themselves immersed in a real situation could connect with others and enact an entire detailed scheme simply by a code. In this case, the code is A27, Allentown, PA, 7810 AM. When I used the code, my buddies knew I'd be heading down Route 178 and would arrive for a 10 a.m. car swap at Allentown. They sent me a message back with the location of this IHOP. I knew there would be a canopy-covered gas station across the street. The waitress returned carrying food. Marty asked her to bring the bill immediately. At this point, he wanted to be as much in control of the clock as possible. He spread the dishes out, and the three companions ate almost everything without any further conversation. Sid finally broke the silence by asking, "Do you have a friend who has rented a car that we're going to take over?" "Yes." "How the hell are they going to do that without compromising themselves?" "It's all been done under my new identity. We'll find my new driver's license and credit card in the glove compartment of the car, along with the rental contract. They will all be under a new identity." Marty was looking at Sid, prepared for the surprised look. After seeing it, Marty continued, "It's the way we play the game." The waitress came back asking if everything was all right and leaving them the bill. Marty had his mouth full and pointed at Sid and then the bill. Sid got the message and took out cash to pay. Marty again looked at his watch. Nellie asked, "Should we get coffee to take with us?" Marty responded, "Not necessary." He didn't elaborate, but continued, "Sid, what kind of gas mileage do you get on that Cherokee? Nellie, you got a paper and pen?" When the pen and paper materialized out of Nellie's purse, Marty wrote down the number of MPG Sid had given him. "We'll leave this paper in the ashtray to give the new driver a heads up on how far he can go on a tank of gas." As they finished eating, Marty quickly detailed the roles that each person would play. Sid and Nellie were both impressed. If Marty was crazy, they'd soon know it. If this car swap happened, neither Sid nor Nellie could find reason to doubt Marty and his group. James Morris was back at the house and in front of his console. The images of lights were superimposed on the map. It was only a few moments before Morris identified one light moving away from Route 178 into Allentown. Tad Taylor was already on the speakerphone. Morris asked, "Can you see the target?" "Yes," Taylor acknowledged. "Confirm ID of the occupants and get back to me." It would take some time to focus the best satellite on the target. Jimmy did not have any doubt that it was Sid's car. Jimmy did have a lot of doubt of what to do next. Sid and Nellie were out in the cold. It would not be difficult to follow them during day from space. Actually, physically, picking them up would only be problematic from the standpoint of location. The fewer bystanders who could become witnesses, the better. Jimmy had to arrange for a ground team to get behind and following the Jeep Cherokee before nightfall. But then what? The shrewd thing to do would be to have them disappeared. Jimmy got up and walked toward the window in the ocean. Silently, he asked himself, "Am I getting soft? What happens if I just let them go? Would Sid and Nellie just stay silent and keep their heads down? What if they went to the press or the police?" Jimmy was actually surprised that they'd not made the police move after the killing at Nellie's apartment. That was suspicious. What made Sid turn rabbit? It had to be Nellie. She was the one searching the internet for anything related to 9/11, and a huge assortment of other type conspiracy websites. Maybe Sid could talk Nellie down. Although, Jimmy thought, Nellie seemed to be taking after her mother, and there was no way that anyone could talk down Sarah. Jimmy really liked Sarah. She was one of the few civilians who had an inkling as to what was reality. He so much enjoyed the early years when they were all together. Sarah and Sid had become a couple in high school. Both of them were definitely liberals at heart, while Jimmy leaned toward conservatism. During the turbulent years of the 1960s, Sarah had become progressively more radical, to Jimmy's way of thinking. From things Sid had said, Sarah had continued down the path of eccentricity and had become a student of metaphysics and drawn into more radical thinking of conspiracies everywhere. In the end, Sarah had become too radical even for Sid. Jimmy had argued against Sarah's view of the world. In the end, Jimmy discovered she was much more right than wrong. But even Sarah did not have a clue as to how vastly different the world was compared to what most Americans thought it was. If Nellie was like Sarah, Nellie would be too paranoid to trust any form of government authority, but it still did not feel right. Jimmy thought, "I'm missing something," and he started reviewing the attack plan. From the very beginning, total destruction of the towers was not a desired ending of the plan. The main thrust was an attack on American soil by Arab fanatics. That alone would set up a mental state in America, resulting in more control over everything. But the attack could lead to a situation where the towers were in danger of collapse, and the resulting threat to everything else in the World Trade Center. They had to control collateral damage, and the best insurance against that was putting a demolition system in place. The system was in fact a fail-safe to protect the surrounding buildings. As James Morris understood it, Carlin's first plan only included the Pentagon attack. Someone above him wanted more. An attack against a military target might not be enough to infuriate the American public. There'd been a dozen terrorist attacks against American military forces that made very little impact upon the American psyche. It was then that the Twin Towers became targets, and that was primarily because the towers were navigational waypoints. Waypoints have been around ever since mankind began navigating. Early hunters followed routes marked by trees, rocks, water, or a variety of natural objects. Early pilots followed roads or rivers and water towers with names of towns painted on them. They were the real favorites. With the advent of radio signals, waypoints took on new dimensions. It began in World War II. Aircraft receivers would pick up radio signals from ground-based transmitters. The receivers analyzed the signals and determined if the plane was flying toward or away from a given transmitter. As electronic systems improved, speed and location of the plane became determinable. By the end of the 20th century, radio navigation systems were all over the world, and the primary way of navigation for both air and sea. With the advent of satellites, global positioning systems, or GPS, become a reality. Instead of ground-based transmitters with their limited range, satellites could beam down a signal to a vastly larger area. Navigational signals beamed from satellites provided way more accuracy than ground-based transmitters. Well, guys, this isn't really a good place to stop, but I'm going to have to. I thank y'all for listening.